So natural law challenges the modern distinction between fact and values, and I just wanted to pause a moment and see if you understood what that distinction really is. Can somebody kind of sum up what that means to distinguish facts from values?
Well, it's just that like values tend to be relative or subjective, while facts are universal. They can't be contested.
Very good. Yeah, that's usually the way, something like the way it's put. You know, values can be a matter of opinion, so to speak, or they can be relative to person, place, time, etc. But a fact is something that you can see with your own eyes or that you can empirically measure. Right? Anybody want to add anything to that? So I mean, this is a distinction that is made in modern social science, definitely, and we'll talk about that. But Arnhart raises it with the question of which position is right, positivism or natural law. So we'll have to talk about positivism. But positivism is about this distinction between facts and values. So he cites this French philosopher Kant, who is sort of the father of positivism, and whose ideas had a great impact on legal thinking. Okay? Kant said that we need to only examine or talk about those things which we know through direct experience. In order to be objective and in order to really know anything, we have to talk about what we can either directly experience, or he did include the realm of pure logic. Okay? There's no way, in other words, that we can argue that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, so he includes that. Okay? So we know things because we either directly see, touch, measure, okay, or because it's irrefutably true through logic. Okay? But logic does not include much else except for the mathematical reasoning. Okay? Because when it comes to moral reasoning, Kant excluded that. It's not in the realm of logic. It has to do with values. It has to do with opinions. The way he put it was that he was going to exclude all, quote, metaphysical speculation. Okay? What does metaphysical mean?
Spiritual, like more than physical?
Yeah, it's not physical. Yeah, it's beyond the physical. And so, yeah, the spiritual would be one example of that, but not the only one. Okay? Deals with reasoning about things that you can't see, okay? And you can't know with absolute certainty, okay? In the same way that you can with mathematics. So that includes religious beliefs, but also moral codes, which is pertinent for our discussion. He would put moral codes in this realm. Okay? Now, you can see, hopefully, how that differs from Aquinas' opinion. What would Aquinas say to that, do you think? To the idea that a moral code, like his natural law theory, is just metaphysical and can't be really strictly proven.
I think he would argue that you can prove your moral code by the way you conduct yourself in your everyday life. Like you can, like people can see, like if you're like moral code, like is that you're an honorable person and that you always do right by people, people can see that.
Well, even more than that, you know, you're right that your actions can be seen by others, but he would argue beyond that, that people can see what moral code works and what doesn't. In other words, if you are honorable and basically honest and you know, follow this code, are you happier? Are you more stable? Is your family more secure? If a society lives this way, is it more prosperous? Is it more stable? Is it more secure? Or not, you know? And on that basis, you have some empirical proof, so to speak, that this code works, that it fits human nature, that it fits somehow the way we are. See, so Aquinas and other natural law thinkers thought that they were dealing with facts. Okay, for instance, when Aquinas starts out with self-preservation and then societal preservation, he considers that to be a fact of human nature, and those moral codes that recognize that and that, you know, foster self-preservation and preservation of society work better than those that don't. Okay, So he would disagree with this distinction. But why do other people claim that moral codes like natural law are about something we can't know? Okay? Why is it that, you started out by saying, well, values, are relative. Why do people think that, and that that values can't be facts?
Not everybody has the same definition of what is honorable or what is being just.
Mm-hmm. There's disagreements about what's just and honorable. We see this all the time. Like one of the big issues right now has to do with the family and gay marriage, right? Whether marriage is for heterosexuals or whether marriage can be applied to other people. So there's a lot of dispute about something that's very much a moral issue, and that leaves us with the impression that we can't really ultimately decide on the basis of facts. Where is the fact in this case? Okay. Anything else? Any other reason why people tend to say that values can't be facts?
They change easily. Like someone can change their values at any time. A lot of times they do. So it's hard to have something that's supposed to be set in stone when it can be changeable.
Okay. That's good. People can change their values, and they often do, in individuals. And you could also argue in history, you can see historical change in value systems too. In my DAS 300 class, we go from ancient to, very recent times. And we start out with Homer's Iliad, and what's admirable and respectable in archaic Greece, as expressed by Homer, does seem to be different from, say, what our society, quite a bit different from what our society would consider heroic and honorable. There's some overlap, but there's a lot of stuff that doesn't sound like anything we would admire. So it would seem that history supports this idea that values are relative. Okay? And then there's the problem, you guys didn't mention, but it was very much on the minds of a lot of our founders, for instance. Not that they're complete relatives, they weren't, but this was on their mind. They solved it in a different way. People fight about them. Okay, so not only do they disagree intellectually, but they fight. And this makes people kind of afraid to bring this up and argue about moral values. Okay? You might think you're right, but you hesitate because you think this may cause some fight, either just a verbal fight or even worse, a physical fight. And of course, a lot of the wars of the Middle Ages and then of the Reformation were about ideas, especially post-Reformation. So, the lesson that we supposedly learned from that is that maybe we shouldn't try to define, make definitive our values, and we should allow other people to have theirs and just, substitute tolerance for certainty. So this is another reason why the Aquinian approach has been somewhat rejected. So, but the question remains, and this is the challenge that Aquinas poses, and I guess Arnhart does for the sake of his political questions. Must we see moral codes this way, as basically incapable of resolution, a cause of nothing but disputes and conflicts, and that we just have to somehow avoid? Okay? Well, in the social sciences, we've done that. We've avoided the issue, okay? And we've embraced empiricism, okay? Which means that, social scientists say they strive for just examining the facts. And in fact, we've tried to move as close to the natural sciences as we possibly can. We can't run experiments on people, but we can collect a lot of data, and we can deal with numbers as much as possible. And this to take out the opinion and the philosophizing out of it, okay? So social scientists will say, values exist, but we can't prove them we all have values, but we can't empirically prove or justify them. And so when we do our social science, we put them to one side and we just try to deal with facts. Okay? Has anybody run into this in their political science major, into this basic strategy of putting the values to one side as irresolvable? Your professors talked about that. Maybe they just do it rather than talk about it, but it's a basic underlying principle that's been well established in the social sciences. And oftentimes what you'll see, not so much in articles but in books, authors will say, they'll come right out and sort of come out and say, I'm a Catholic, or I'm a Democrat, or whatever it is that sort of fuels their own value system. So I'm going to come out and be honest about that, but I'm going to try as hard as I can to be objective. I want you to know my biases, but my biases I'm going to try hard to not let my biases interfere with my ability to do this scholarship. Okay? So, do you think that political scientists do that well? They try? Okay. So, this leaves, a lot of the political world behind in a way. Okay? By that I mean that so much of the political landscape is about values. Include almost everything that politicians dispute about. That by taking it off the table, we do preserve objectivity to a degree, but we can't always deal with the most important questions that people are actually voting about, participating in the political world about. Okay, does that make sense? So there's a price that you pay, especially in politics, for empiricism, and that is not only do you put your biases off the table, but it becomes difficult for you to reason about what so much of the political world is about. Okay? I would say probably 98% values. So, one of the reasons for focusing on this is to ask ourselves whether it's possible for social scientists to reason about values after all. I mean, is it possible for people to make decent arguments about these things, or do we have to just put them off the table? Arnhart also mentions legal positives, people in the legal system. When they write, the legal positivists will say, we can't judge laws to be just or unjust because that would be to judge them by a higher transcendent standard, but we can't see that higher transcendent standard, so the only way to judge whether a law is valid is whether it's been duly promulgated and can be enforced. Okay? And so legal positivists say it's not a law if it's not enforced. It's a norm, but not a law. Okay? Whether it's just or not is a matter of moral judgment or values, and that's outside the realm of legal analysis. It's a matter of opinion, maybe a matter for the voters to decide. But a law is a law if it's enforced, because then it becomes real to the people under the law. Does that make sense? Otherwise, it's just an opinion. All right. So this leads to the issue that Arnhart raises about international law and just war, because what do we know about the enforcement of international law? What have you learned about that?
It's very hard to do.
Yeah.
There's no good accountability system.
Right. Why is there no good accountability system to enforce international law?
Because of sovereignty of other countries, we can't really just go and say you have to do this.
Right, right. These countries are sovereign and they don't want to cede their sovereignty to some bigger organization.
It's a voluntary system.
It is, right. And so a legal positivist would say, normally, most of them would say, if it's a voluntary system and then it's not strictly enforced uniformly, these are not really laws. They're more like international norms. People talk about them. Sometimes they can be enforced because the countries involved agree, but other times they won't be because there's disagreement. So we can't call them laws. And it's very problematic to have these because they raise expectations about what can be done, okay? But the follow-through is not always there. You know, like if country X, there's war crimes going on there, they're abusing their own people, something like that is going on, it's obviously against international law. But whether enforcement happens is a matter of whether there's countries out there willing to do it, to intervene, to use force, probably in order to stop these violations of international law. And that depends on politics, right? Depends on whether these countries have an interest in doing so. So there's no overarching world government because states won't cede their sovereignty. And so enforcement is very sporadic. And so whether you're looking at international or just war, which is often most of just war rules are in international law, you find that the lack of enforcement makes legal positivists say they're not laws. Okay? And actually they can cause more harm than good because they raise expectations. Now, Arnhart mentions one exception, a positivist by the name of Hart, who saw this problem and wanted to kind of salvage international law by taking away the enforcement criteria as necessary. So what Hart did was he said that, you know, it's not force that makes these laws valid, but rather agreement. And if there's enough agreement amongst enough nations to enforce in any particular case, then it's a law. Okay? So the agreement amongst nations and that they agree upon the validity of the law is what makes it a law. It's still not saying that the law has anything to do, it's not legitimate because it makes moral sense. Hart's not using any sort of natural law argument. In fact, he's still very much a positivist. He's saying it's a law. A law is a law if enough states, in this case, agree to it. Or a law is a law if enough people at the domestic level agree to it and agree to abide by it. Okay. So, is there anything wrong with this? Can you see any problems with taking this step back and saying, you know, enforcement is not the measure of whether it's a law, but agreement?
I think it's a lot better because the train of thought from the previous, how it's whatever authority enforcement, that sounds a lot like in the, what was it, the Republic, the man who said how justice is only from the strong, that kind of line of thought. Yeah. That's basically what it was earlier with the enforcement issue, so I think this is better.
Okay, so you like it better because it's not just about force. And that's a very good point. Yeah, legal positivism often does come down to force, and that's something that if you're sensitive to, you know, issues like tyranny, authoritarianism, and so forth, you don't particularly like the idea that it just boils down to who's got the gun, so to speak. Yeah.
So it's a law without enforcement is just wishful thinking.
Okay. Yeah. So his response is, if there's no enforcement, then it's just wishful thinking. It's just, we like this. And that's in practice, that's the problem, okay, with Hart's view, is that the agreement may exist now, but will it exist when the going gets rough, when you actually have to do something? And what we see in international relations is lots of countries will agree to a particular convention, a principle of action, but then in any particular case, the agreement breaks down. Maybe not openly, but some countries just won't do anything, right? Then they might even make a statement to the effect that they agree with the principle, but they don't actually take any sort of action. So it's problematic at the level of action, of actually implementation. But, you know, in practice, international law is whichever justification you use, because it can't be enforced specifically by a world government. We know that. That's not going to happen. And the alternative, Hart's view, is what we try, that's what we try, and it succeeds when enough powerful countries want it to, but otherwise not, so it's not consistent. So, given that, I think that Arnhardt's asking if the positivist underpinning or the positivist reaction to international law doesn't really help make it any more seriously enforceable or seriously taken, then do we have to stick with that? Do we have to stick with the idea that a law is a law just because it's enforced or just because there's a level of agreement? Okay? Or can we reason about right and wrong independently of either force or agreement? Because we are never going to have, this is probably too definitive a statement, but it would seem that we're never going to have the level of consistent agreement and certainly the level of enforcement it takes to always have international law work. All right, so can we reason about moral standards after all? Okay, of course, in the context of Aquinas would say yes. Okay? Now, many people, as we've already discussed, say we can't use reason to judge moral standards because moral values are a matter of personal choice, right? And we often say that two people can both be right, okay, from different perspectives. Okay? Or that neither is right because it's inappropriate to even use the term right, okay? Because when it comes to morals, it really is a matter of perspective. No one's right. People can be different on this. And we've talked about various ways or various reasons why people think this way. Okay? But the fact that we've never gotten agreement on moral values is probably the most important one, philosophically speaking. Okay? We've never been able to get full agreement. Okay? And sometimes competing values really do seem to have good backing for both sides. And this makes it confusing for us. From different angles, we can see how both make sense. For instance, what arguments can be posed for basically saying that drinking is always immoral? What might you argue if you tried to argue that drinking is immoral and wrong?
Red wine's good for your heart.
No, that's against my proposition. What if you had to defend that drinking is immoral and wrong?
Drunk driving accidents.
Okay, the drunk driving accidents, the consequences of drinking.
Like the health risk of drinking?
The what? The health risks, yes.
It alters your state of mind.
Mm-hmm, yep. I mean, Thomas Hobbes said about drinking against, let's see, what did he put it? He had a natural law against drunkenness. He didn't say no drinking allowed, but there was a natural law against drunkenness precisely because of that. It alters the way you think, and when you don't have good judgment, then you can do things which can cause war, that can cause, problems with people, that can lead to conflict. So when you lose your judgment, you can get into trouble. Now, for Hobbes, that meant be very moderate, I think. I don't think I ever saw Hobbes say you should never have a drink. He wasn't that type, but you have to be very moderate so that you don't lose your judgment. If we were going to just outlaw it entirely, could we use these examples as good reasons?
Try.
Yeah?
These days, probably not,
Uh-huh.
because we already tried that, it didn't work, so.
That's right, we did. Yeah, we tried it, and what we got was the mafia. People got around it. If we could somehow do it perfectly, we might be able to argue society would be better off without the temptation to abuse it. Okay, but the same could be, Mayor Bloomberg has taken away our sodas and so forth. So there's a lot of things that are bad for us. But if you sort of take away everything from people, it doesn't necessarily help make them better. But I think you could make an argument that drinking is wrong on the basis of, it's somewhat persuasive on the basis of it always makes you lose your judgment. Okay? Even one drink slightly impairs your judgment. Okay? So if having good sense at all times is important for societal peace, you could definitely make that argument. On the other side, what arguments would you make that drinking is not wrong or immoral? What's that?
It's awesome.
I still didn't hear you.
I said it's awesome.
It's awesome. It's not good enough.
I know like a lot of people like can make the claim that like in the Bible Jesus drank wine kind of thing.
Okay, so you could go back to biblical. If your morality comes from that biblical basis, you can show that Christ didn't teach teetotaling. Anything else?
It impairs your judgment for the better, like euphoria.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
So it might actually make a person more peaceful or more adaptive to life if they're not constantly in a state of absolute awareness. Possibly. I've actually heard people argue that, say, in fact, I remember when I had my one and only child, the doctor who birthed him said, well, now, even though you're going to naturally feed your child, it's okay to have 1 beer a day, and I highly recommend it because now you're going to be under an incredible amount of stress, and you're going to get no sleep. So she said, have 1 beer a day, but don't go beyond that. Oh, that's cool. I thought I would have to be completely no caffeine, no alcohol for an entire year. So, yes, that's the counter argument, is that it's something that's been done a long time. In moderation, it makes a person relax. It might actually make their relationships with other people better. Okay. Anything else? Somebody mentioned already the health aspects of it. In moderation, that's a scientific argument. I suppose you could prove it's not necessarily bad for you unless you do it a lot. Right? Well, it's a little bit harder on the morality scale to say that drinking is okay. You can argue that it is not harmful. It's a little bit harder to argue it's good, but I think that was a pretty good attempt. But you can see how people people could get into a real fight about this, couldn't they? I'm sure during Prohibition that many people got into fist fights about this. And that families argued amongst themselves about it, so forth, and whether bootleg alcohol ought to be bought or not. And in a lot of cases, I think that the prohibition side came from a very religious perspective, but not always. And the idea was that drinking is just losing control, and then you're at risk of not being as good a person. So the fact that a lot of these types of issues can be argued back and forth, and people on both sides can sound reasonable, and they can sound well-meaning, and they can have moral arguments, okay, for their particular side, makes people want to stand back and say, well, let's not fight about this at all. Let's just tolerate, okay? You can have your view about alcohol, I'll have mine. Maybe we won't have a drink together because you think it's bad, but we will just accept each other's differences and not make a big deal out of it. It's your lifestyle. In fact, I like the term lifestyle because it really encapsulates the modern solution to these dilemmas, as you'll say, he's got his lifestyle, I've got mine, And we sort of put the lifestyle over here. It's not the core of a person, which you can still respect and you can still accept and so forth. But the lifestyle is a personal choice. It's really kind of, up to the individual and really not something that other people ought to pry into or try to judge. Okay? Now, there is a problem with that solution, which is a modern liberal solution. If you've studied the founding with Dr. Frank, right from the founding, the expression of the liberal solution was we're going to take a lot of things off the table as personal choice, religion being the number one. right? We're going to say everybody has freedom of religion. The state is not involved. If you want to be religious, if you want to embrace a particular variety of religion, it's not my business. You're free to do that. We're not going to bring that into our social relations, and we're not going to bring it into the public square, okay? And that was kind of the way to keep the peace. And as liberalism advanced, more and more of those issues got put into that private realm. You know, it was private business. Public business is about, you know, roads, bridges, and the post office and national defense and things like that that we can all agree on. Okay? But Arnhart does raise some problems with this resolution of putting a lot of things off the table that we can't discuss, because there are other things that we really do feel like we want to discuss still. Okay? Some things it seems like we find hard to put off the table, even though they really seem to be in the moral realm and in the realm of some disagreement too. And he points out that even the positivist heart was not quite ready to totally give up on natural law, though he wouldn't admit it. He put this instinct for self-preservation into the realm of a fact. Okay? He thought it was so universally true that it could be a fact, and therefore that laws against theft and violence seemed self-evident, okay? Not a matter of opinion to heart. And so that leads to the question, are there other things that we can make a moral argument about that are very relevant for society and for international relations? Are there places where murder and theft are promoted in the moral code?
Things like in the just war theory, I mean, some people would call it murder to go to war, but in some cases it'd probably be promoted.
Mm-hmm. So if we say killing instead of murder in particular,
right,
then we would include nations' justifications for
yeah, I think that murder is kind of like a loaded word to
yeah,
use. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, and a lot of societies make this distinction between killing and murder, including our own. And murder is unjust killing. They may differ about what unjust killing includes, you know. So we've got that. People who believe in jihad believe in a type of killing that maybe people in the West would definitely consider to be unjust, right? They think it is just because it forwards the cause of jihad. Okay? So, you know, if we ask this question seriously, we would have to say yes, but again, according to what definition of what constitutes murder, what constitutes unjust killing, and people vary about that. But do you want to leave it at that, I think is what Arnhart's asking. You know, for instance, do you really want to say that killing what we would call in the West innocent people, women, children, various non-combatants, is just relative, you know, it's just a different definition of justice. Okay? And there are other issues like that that sort of beg for moral judgment, where when it comes right down to it, even social scientists will not maintain their positivistic position. Okay? Most social scientists wouldn't maintain their positivistic position when it comes to the killing of innocents. In fact, I've never met a single one who basically said, well, that's a moral issue and we can't really talk about it. Okay? Instead, they're quite clear. They think that's unjust, no matter whether a whole society thinks it's justified or not. But we try to avoid, or we tend to avoid, I should say, having philosophical discussions about it because we wonder whether we can actually prove it or not based on our own assumptions. Okay? Here's some other issues where I think even most very objective social scientists would sort of cry out for some sort of moral judgment. Spousal and child abuse. Is it morally permissible to beat your wife? There are some societies where it is. Is it okay for them and not for us? Is it really a matter of moral relativity? Racism, gross racism. Now, as it says there, the Southerners made the argument that their laws were duly promulgated, and the majority voted, and that slavery represented their way of life. And slavery exists all, in various places around the world to this day. So, do we really want to say that slavery is okay for them and not for us? See, it becomes harder in these cases, in very extreme cases. But you sort of feel like you don't want to go that far. And I think by pointing these things out, Arnhardt's trying to maybe show why natural law reasoning should not be dismissed, because it's pretty much the avenue for arguing against these types of things. Okay? It's superior to a purely religious argument, because religious arguments hinge on whether a person believes in that particular religion. Natural law transcends religious arguments. In this case, it was formulated by Aquinas, but Aquinas took care to make arguments that can apply to non-believers as well as believers. So, especially with these first two and the previous example, okay, these are such difficult issues for people to simply say, I can't judge. Everybody judges. And even people within societies where these things happen, many of them judge the same way. There's a lot of people who don't agree with what's going on. So, now on the issue of free speech, modern natural law thinkers definitely say freedom of speech is a right, it's something that everybody ought to have. But this is a problematic one for Thomas, and it shows the difference between medieval and modern natural law. Thomas actually says that the government is within its rights, the government is justified in suppressing a certain amount of speech is not good for the community. And this comes from his particular medieval Christian perspective, right? Heresy, would be justifiably outlawed. Yeah, heretical Christian ideas, seditious ideas aimed at toppling the legitimate government. His bar would be quite a bit lower than ours as far as any sort of suppression of speech, because his emphasis was on creating this atmosphere in which people could live good moral lives, and so, because of that, he would be more likely to say, yes, the government can suppress certain types of speech, and the government can actually promote the good life by doing things such as supporting the church and encouraging religious life, religious practices, and so forth. Okay, so that's a difference between then and now, in the approach. The older natural law theorists thought that natural law supported government that fostered the good life, following along Aristotle's lines. Government is for fostering the good life. The modern natural law backs away from that because of the things that we've talked about. The fact that, when it comes to what promotes the good life, people argue, people disagree, and as I said, especially since the Protestant Reformation, not only do you have Protestants versus Catholics, but Protestants versus Protestants, as they battled with each other for political dominance. Okay? And so the good life got relegated to the individual choice, and that's why the difference between medieval and modern natural law. Okay? So, this question, why not disallow ideas that are obviously harmful and contrary to natural law? I'm fascinated by these people, the communitarians like M.T. Etzioni. they're contemporary scholars who are, you know, a part of this communitarian school who criticizes modern liberalism for having gone too far in ceding the ground to individuals to define what the good life is. And so they will actually make arguments to the effect that government needs to promote, again, some sort of unified moral code. They'll say it can't be along the lines of a particular religion, but it can be something, you know, moral rules that pretty much everybody can agree to. And that government may need to suppress a certain amount of speech in order to create a more harmonious, for instance, racism and anti-Semitism, okay, in order to create a more harmonious society. And they argue that we can do this within liberalism as long as we maintain this balance between freedom and order and unity. So it's not a foregone conclusion amongst all people that we can have a government that both provides us freedom, but also creates more of a sense of the good life and promotes it, and therefore makes some more moral judgments and promotes them to the people. It's interesting. They are a small, you know, they had some influence in the past. They have less so now. Okay. So I'm going to go back and read some of these people again, because it's been a while. Okay. So I'll just leave that up there. But basically, these are some of the modern liberal reasons why we've tended to move away from the older natural law, but we still, in modern liberal thought, want to defend against certain really, you know, immoral practices, such as slavery, such as, you know, child and spousal abuse and those kind of things. We do it within this modern framework. There's a lot of stuff that we leave off the table, including religion in particular. Lifestyle choices like marriage, more and more, I guess. But we haven't completely abandoned moral judgment. And well, I think what Arnhart is trying to get across is if we haven't really completely abandoned moral judgment after all, because there's certain things that we will balk at, then we need to understand the basis of our judgments rather than simply have them be prejudices or gut level reactions. We need to have an argument for them. And that's a reason for going back and studying the development of natural law. Because the natural law thinker insists there are some values that really are facts that can be proven to be true because these are better for people than the alternative. Okay? So I'll leave that up there for you. Any questions or any comments before we move out of Thomas Aquinas?
I kind of just had a random question about that Holmes guy.
Mm-hmm.
What would you think about like deductive reasoning? Like, is that close enough to like based on mathematical ideas that you would accept it, or is it?
I don't think so. I think he's one that argues against that type of reasoning. Yeah, because it does have to do with more than just the gathering of facts. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm right about that. Anything else? Uh-huh.
I have a question about the Communitarians.
Uh-huh.
How would they, I guess, look at history and see how we have changed morally throughout the years and come to the conclusion that government should stifle like free speech? Because
Mm-hmm.
like saying like, you know, anti-Semitism and racism, you know, was that long ago where it was the opposite, where it was like okay to be racist against certain people, and then people, because of free speech, were able to like change the minds of others in the government. So wouldn't it be more like they would be more in support of people being able to have free speech, even if it is against the so-called moral code of what country is?
Yeah, in other words, are they so sure that they're right that they're willing to? I think that to a certain extent they are. In other words, and maybe this is a little bit of a lack of reflection on their part, you know, that they sound to me like they think that they know better now based upon that previous experience, what works and what doesn't work, what's right and what's wrong. And they would argue for having certain limits in speech and expression based upon the damage that some of it does. Like some of them will argue against free and open pornography and sex shops and so forth because it causes so much obvious damage, or against free and open gambling, for instance, another area where there's a lot of damage that can be done. They sort of point to some of the problems associated with some of these things and say, and racist, anti-Semitic speech causes conflict and hatred and so forth. And they think it's kind of obvious, but I think that as far as an answer to your question, how would they respond? I've only read some of this stuff, but I haven't seen a good answer to your question. I think they're pretty certain of what they think.